Buried beneath the earth for 2,000 years, a skeleton lay in complete darkness. Its bones had turned to fragile ivory. Its teeth had weathered the millennia. All memory of who this person was had vanished. No name, no epitaph, no mourning survivors to remember their face. They were forgotten, lost to time itself. But then, in our modern age, scientists made a discovery that seemed impossible. They brought the dead back to life, not as a living person, but as a voice from the past. And what that voice had to tell us would shatter everything we thought we knew about this particular skeleton. It would reveal a family lost to history, a mystery spanning 2,000 years. And it would prove that DNA is not just the code of life, it is a time machine. In 2017, archaeologists in Scotland were excavating a burial site from the Iron Age when they uncovered something extraordinary. Beneath layers of compacted earth, they found a skeleton that immediately caught their attention. It had been laid to rest, with remarkable care. Grave goods surrounded the bones, pottery, jewelry, weapons, all suggesting this person had been significant in life, important enough to be given an elaborate burial. Yet despite these clues, despite the meticulous preservation, despite everything that archaeologists could see with their own eyes, they could not answer the most fundamental question. Who was this person? Male or female? Young or old? A warrior? A healer? An aristocrat? A slave? The skeleton kept its secrets locked away in the calcium and phosphate of ancient bone. This is where the story takes an astonishing turn. The lead archaeologist decided to do something that would have been impossible just a generation earlier. She sent samples of the skeleton's bone to a genetic laboratory. She was going to unlock the skeleton's identity, not through traditional archaeology, but through DNA analysis. The bone samples were processed in sterile conditions. The DNA was extracted, carefully, painstakingly, because ancient DNA is fragile. It degrades over time, it breaks apart into fragments. After 2,000 years, the DNA in these bones was not a pristine, complete genome. It was shattered, broken into millions of tiny pieces. The laboratory's job was to reassemble this genetic jigsaw puzzle and read what remained. What emerged from the analysis stunned everyone involved. The skeleton was female. She had lived sometime around the year 200 CE, during the height of the Roman Empire's expansion into Britain. She was likely between 20 and 30 years old when she died. But here is where the real mystery begins. The DNA showed something unexpected, something that would lead archaeologists on a detective journey spanning continents and centuries. This woman's genetics indicated Scandinavian ancestry. Specifically, she carried DNA markers that are common in Denmark and southern Sweden. But this burial was in Scotland, in the Iron Age. How did a Scandinavian woman end up buried in Scotland 2,000 years ago? What path had led her across the brutal North Sea? What events had shaped her life? And who was her family? To answer these questions, scientists employed a technique that barely existed a decade earlier. They compared her DNA against thousands of modern genetic databases. They were looking for matches, living people, today who shared significant portions of DNA with this ancient skeleton. If they could find her living descendants, if they could trace the genetic lineage from her to the present day, they might be able to tell her story. They might be able to connect her bones to a chain of inheritance stretching to name, discovered through genetic testing that he was a direct descendant of this skeleton, not through some distant, barely traceable lineage, but through a clear, unbroken chain of inheritance. When he received the letter telling him that his DNA matched an ancient skeleton buried in Scotland 2,000 years ago, he thought there must be a mistake. He was a modern man living in the 21st century. How could he possibly be related to someone who had died nearly 2 millennia in the past? Yet the genetic evidence was unmistakable. His Y chromosome carried sequences that nearly perfectly matched sequences extracted from ancient bone. He was, impossibly, genetically connected to this mysterious woman from the Iron Age. But this discovery, remarkable as it was, only deepened the mystery. How had this Scandinavian woman ended up in Scotland? The most likely explanation emerged from archaeological context and historical records. During the Iron Age and the early Roman period, Scandinavian peoples were beginning their explorations southward and westward. Trade networks were expanding, raiding parties were venturing into new territories, some Scandinavian families were establishing settlements in Scotland and northern Britain. This woman may have been part of a trading expedition. She may have been captured in a raid. She may have traveled willingly, seeking new opportunities. She may have been a bride, sent from her homeland to cement a political alliance with a Scottish clan. The DNA could confirm her ancestry. It could confirm her descent through the ages, but it could not tell us her story. It could not explain the human experiences and emotions and decisions that brought her to this distant shore. Yet other details began to emerge when scientists conducted more sophisticated genetic analysis. They examined the chemical composition of her bones and teeth. They studied isotopes, versions of elements with different numbers of neutrons that accumulate in the body based on diet and geography. The isotope ratios suggested that she had grown up in Scandinavia. She had consumed foods native to that region. She had drunk water from northern lands. But later in life, the isotope ratios changed. Around the time she would have been in her early 20s, the chemical signature of her body shifted. She had moved. She had arrived in Scotland. She had spent the final years of her life, perhaps 5 to 10 years, in this new land, eating new foods, drinking new water. Her bones had literally absorbed the geography of her new home. She was a migrant, a woman displaced from everything she knew, a woman who had traveled to a foreign land and made it her home. The story grows even more poignant when we consider what came next. When she died, and we do not know exactly how or why, though analysis of her bones shows no evidence of trauma or disease, her community honored her. They gave her an elaborate burial. They surrounded her skeleton with grave goods. They treated her not as a stranger, but as one of their own, someone worthy of respect, someone whose memory deserved preservation, someone whose death was mourned. For 20 centuries, her identity remained unknown. But then DNA revealed her secret. She was not truly lost. She was not truly forgotten. She lived on in the genetic code of thousands of descendants scattered across Europe. Every one of her descendants carried a fragment of her life within them. Every genetic sequence they inherited connected them to this woman, to this moment, to this place. What makes this story extraordinary is not just the romantic narrative of a migrant woman building a new life. It is what her skeleton reveals about the connectivity of human civilization. Her DNA proved that 2,000 years ago people were not isolated in separate continents, speaking different languages, evolving independently. They were connected, they were trading, they were moving, they were mixing. Genetic material was flowing across geography. Families were spanning continents. A woman born in Scandinavia could travel to Scotland and be welcomed into a community that would honor her death with an elaborate burial. Her descendants would continue to pass along her genetic code through the ages. Through invasions and migrations and the rise and fall of kingdoms, her family line persisted. Vikings would eventually raid the same lands where she was buried. Romans would occupy Britain. Anglo-Saxons would establish kingdoms. Normans would conquer. Yet through it all, her genetic legacy continued. This realization transforms how we understand the past. History books tend to emphasize conflict, conquest, and the rise and fall of empires. They speak of invasions and migrations in sweeping, impersonal terms. Thousands of people moving, displaced, integrated, disappeared into larger populations. But DNA reveals the personal side of these historical processes. There were individuals, real people with hopes and fears and families. This woman was one of countless migrants throughout human history who left their homes and ventured into unknown lands. She was part of a process of cultural exchange and integration that had been occurring since humans first developed boats capable of crossing seas. She was part of the invisible story of human connection that DNA alone could reveal. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond this one skeleton. Scientists began applying the same techniques to other ancient remains. Archaeologists across the world started submitting samples for genetic analysis, and what they discovered was staggering. An ancient skeleton from 10,000 years ago in the Caucasus was genetically connected to modern people in the Middle East. A skeleton from 5,000 years ago in Britain was related to modern inhabitants of the Mediterranean. A skeleton from 3,000 years ago in China carried genetic markers suggesting ancestry from Central Asia. Each of these discoveries told a story of movement, of mixing, of human networks spanning vast distances in deep antiquity. But perhaps the most profound revelation came when scientists began finding that modern people were often genetically connected to multiple ancient populations. A modern Briton might carry genetic sequences from ancient Scandinavia, ancient Rome, ancient Germanic tribes, ancient Celtic peoples. Their genome was literally a palimpsest of all the migrations and invasions and integrations that had shaped their homeland over millennia. The genetic structure of modern populations revealed layer upon layer of historical process. Wars and conflicts that had faded into legend were written in the DNA of living people. Peaceful migrations that left no written record were nevertheless encoded in genetic material. The past was not truly past. It lived on in every cell of the body. This discovery fundamentally changed how archaeologists approached their work. No longer was DNA an exotic tool used only in rare cases. It became essential. When a new skeleton was uncovered, scientists immediately asked, what genetic information can we extract? What ancient lineages can we trace? What migrations can we reconstruct? What family connections can we reveal? The skeleton from Scotland opened a new chapter in archaeology. It showed that the dead could speak in ways that had never been possible before. Bones that had been silent for millennia could suddenly sing with information. They could tell us where people came from, where they traveled, what diseases they carried, what they ate, how they died. They could connect us across vast spans of time to our genetic ancestors. The woman whose skeleton was buried in Scotland 2,000 years ago will never have a name. We will never know her personal story. We will never know her voice or her laughter or her fears. But through DNA, we know her genetics. We know her ancestry. We know that she came from far away and made a new life in a new land. We know that she was valued by her community. We know that her family line continued, branching and spreading across generations and continents. And we know that she still lives in some way in the body of every modern person who carries her genetic code. The woman herself is gone, but her DNA, that remarkable molecule that has endured for 4 billion years, carrying life forward, her DNA survives, it adapts, it passes on, it connects the dead to the living. This is perhaps the greatest gift that DNA science has given us, the ability to hear the voices of the dead, not their actual voices, but the biological whispers encoded in the very fabric of their being. It has allowed archaeologists to write a new history, not the history of emperors and kingdoms, but the history of ordinary people, migrants and travelers and explorers and traders, people who ventured into new lands and built new lives, people whose names were forgotten, whose stories were lost, but whose genetic legacy persisted. DNA has democratized history. It has given voice to the voiceless. It has connected us across time to people we never knew existed. The skeleton of the Scottish burial site has now been studied by researchers from multiple disciplines. Archaeologists have examined the context of the burial. Geneticists have analyzed the DNA. Anthropologists have reconstructed her life based on isotope data and bone structure. Together, these scientists have created a portrait of a woman who crossed an ocean 2,000 years ago to build a life in a foreign land. We will never know why she came or what she hoped to find. We will never know if she was happy or unhappy, fulfilled or regretful. But we know that she lived. And we know that she mattered. And we know that her life continues to echo through time, written in the genetic code of thousands of living descendants. In laboratories around the world, scientists are still using DNA to solve ancient mysteries. Skeletons that have been sitting in museum collections for over a century are finally revealing their secrets. A skeleton that was thought to be male has been identified as female. An isolated burial that seemed unconnected to any known culture has been linked to distant migrations. A population thought to have been genetically isolated has been shown to have had extensive contact with other groups. Each discovery rewrites our understanding of human history. Each genetic revelation adds another layer to the story of how humans spread across the globe, how they connected with each other, how they built civilizations and then watched them fall, how they survived and adapted and persisted. The woman in the Scottish grave could not have known that 2,000 years in the future, scientists would extract the DNA from her bones and use it to tell her story. She could not have imagined that her genetic code would be compared against databases of millions of modern humans searching for matches. She could not have conceived of a world with technology that could read the molecular instruction manual of life itself. Yet her DNA survived through 20 centuries, through countless environmental changes, through being buried in the earth. Her genetic information persisted, waiting to be discovered, waiting to tell its tale. This is the true power of DNA. It is not just the code of life in the present moment, it is a record, a chronicle, a testimony to the past. Every human being alive today carries within their cells the genetic echo of thousands of ancestors. We are walking libraries of human history. Our DNA contains the story of our species' journey across the globe. It contains the migrations and the mixtures and the interactions that shaped our current populations. It contains evidence of ancient diseases that killed our ancestors and shaped our immune systems. It contains traces of evolutionary pressures that forged our bodies and our brains. And now, for the first time in history, we have the tools to read this genetic record. We can peer back through the ages and see not just the kingdoms and the wars and the great events that historians have chronicled, but the personal stories of ordinary people. We can know that a woman born in Scandinavia died on the shores of Scotland. We can know that she was valued enough to be given an elaborate burial. We can know that her family's genetic line continued, spreading across Europe, persisting through the ages, right up until the present day. We can know that there are people alive today, people who have no idea about an ancient burial in Scotland, who carry her DNA in their bodies. They are, in a very real sense, her, not her consciousness or her personality, but her genetic self. The code that made her who she was is still here, still alive, still passing through generations. This is one skeleton's story, but it is also the story of all skeletons ever buried. It is the story of humanity itself. A species that has always been restless, always moving, always seeking new lands and new opportunities. A species that has spread across every continent and survived in every climate. A species whose individuals were forgotten, whose names were lost, but whose genetic legacy endured. DNA has made it possible to finally tell their stories, to finally give voice to the voiceless, to finally connect the present to the past in a way that was never before possible. The skeleton from Scotland waits in a climate-controlled storage facility. The bones are carefully preserved. The DNA sequences are recorded in databases. The story has been told. But the real mystery, the real question that this ancient woman's remains pose to us, still hangs in the air. How many other skeletons are out there in museums, in archaeological sites, in the earth? How many other lost souls are waiting to tell their stories through DNA? How many other connections between the present and the past are waiting? We are only at the beginning of this new archaeological revolution. With each passing year, the technology improves. Ancient DNA that was considered too degraded to analyze can now be read. Entire genomes of people who died thousands of years ago can now be reconstructed from tiny fragments of bone or tooth. We are building a genetic map of human history. We are discovering that our ancestors were far more connected than we ever imagined. We are finding that the boundaries between populations, the lines we have drawn on maps, the divisions we have created, these are all recent inventions. For most of human history, people moved. They mixed. They created families across the landscapes they inhabited. And now, DNA is revealing the truth of this ancient connectivity. It is telling us that we are all, in some very real genetic sense related to everyone, that the woman buried in Scotland 2,000 years ago carries DNA that may exist in fragmented and recombined form in people living today across 3 or 4 continents. That we are not isolated individuals, but threads in a vast tapestry of human connection stretching back through time. The ability to know that we are not separate from our ancestors. They live in us. They shape us. They are us. And now, because of a remarkable science that barely existed 20 years ago, we can finally appreciate the profound reality of that truth. A woman who lived 2,000 years ago continues to exist in the genetic code of thousands of living humans. She is gone, but she is not forgotten. She is not truly dead. She lives on, written in the language of DNA, speaking to us across time, telling us the story of who we are and where we came from. And that is a revolution in human understanding that may prove to be one of the most profound discoveries of our age.